Hello, everyone. Since the last story was so long, about an hour and a half, I decided to do my commentary as a separate episode. So if you're watching this one first, you'll need to go back and watch episode 4. Otherwise, there's not going to be a lot of context to my commentary. So the last story, we continued the story in our series about Lu. And that last story was the Battle of Moiturakuna and the Fosterage of Lu by Teochew. There are 3 levels of meaning in the story that I like to spiral through to kind of get better understanding of what the story is saying. So we're going to start with Sky, which will be the elemental level of the story. And the theme of that is conflict arising from earlier forms of life. The second theme of the story is the sea, and that is the cultural level of the story. And that has to do with legacies of trauma. And the fourth level of the story is land, and that's personal and emotional. And this is the choice between compassion and revenge and the development of our clarity. So in our first spiral through the story, like I said, we'll start with Sky. And Sky is the cosmic or elemental level of the story. And this has to do with conflict arising from earlier forms of life. So if we go back to the beginning of this story, we have the sundering between the Firwalek and the Tuatha and that sundering is caused by the ancient Favaira. And the Favaira means the great ones under the sea. And similar to the Titans or in Greek mythology or the giants in Norse mythology, they are primordial forces that help shape the world. And this, again, we're talking on a cosmic or elemental level of the story at this point. So these would be volcanoes, earthquakes, meteors, comets. The Favoira are the ancient earth shapers, and they're older than the fairy people. There's an amazing image that I got to experience by listening to a documentary about the shaping of the early Earth. And when the Earth was still young and the moon was a lot closer to the planet, the tidal pull of the moon was so intense that as it circled the Earth, it pulled the oceans of the world toward it. And because it was so close, it was like a giant tsunami that followed the moon. And this would be a perfect example of what the consciousness or the power of a Favoiric being would be. They're not evil. They wield overwhelming power. And this doesn't really life as we know it, the ability to thrive. So when you look at the Favaira who caused this initial sundering between the Tuatha and the Firwalek, we're talking about ancient earth forces that are the first dream of the earth. The way in which it's shaped, the basins in which the oceans will fill, the mountains, all of the forces and movement of the earth are the Favoira. And when they say the great ones under the sea, they literally mean under the sea. So beneath the bedrock of the sea, down into the mantle, and the plumes that create Iceland, the plumes that create Hawaii, these ancient forces that can be life destructive, but without them, there would be no life as we know it today. And so this first level of life is often symbolized, the Favoira are often symbolized as having one eye, one leg, and one arm. So this first level of life, not necessarily the most refined, but very powerful, and being the first dream of the earth. If we go with A.E. Russell's cosmology in the Candle of Vision, then Angus Og is the young dreamer in the earth, seeking the beauty of Danu. And the Favoira are the first step in that eternal dream. So if the Favoira are the first dream of the earth, the second dream of the earth on a cosmic or elemental level would be the fairy people, the Sidhe. And these are the root spiritual consciousness or energy of life as we know it. So spirits who are the power of plants, trees, flowers, mountains, rivers, springs, caves, all those things that support and give life its diversity. Without the Sidhe, and without their vision, those things couldn't be, they couldn't exist. And so they uphold the threads of existence for life as we know it here on Earth. So in the story, at one point, the fairy people are one tribe, the Nemedians. And the Nemedians are descended from a king or leader named Nevu. And Nevu, which is the modern pronunciation of his name, would be a being or state of being that is considered holy. So Nevu, even today in Gaelic, means sanctuary, holy thing, holy place, or a state of holiness. When the Sidhe come into conflict with the earlier level of life, represented by the Favoira, it is a process of evolution. And the process, it is the process of the great dream unfolding from one vision into the next. So we often perceive these transitional periods between an older form of life and a newer form of life as a conflict, when in fact it is the dream of the Favoira, the culmination of it, was meant to create the next dream and lay the foundations of the next dream of the fairy people, the Sidhe. They are brothers, and in a lot of the stories they intermarry, just as Lu is part Favoira, part Tuatha Dé Danann. So then let's look at how the Firwalek and the Tuatha Dé Danann differ and how they're the same. So we know that in the story they're descended from one people, one tribe, the Nemedians, the holy people. After their respective sunderings, they develop different insights and they develop different powers. So with the Firwalek, they are the life of the soil. That slow, steady patience, bag by bag, hard work, determination, and resilience that the soil has. And without the soil, without its resilience to take extreme heat, extreme cold, rain, snow, sleet, volcanic eruption, all those things that are constantly thrown at the soil, and its ability to break those things down and to create life out of the hardest of places, out of bare rock. That's the power of the Firwalek. Trauma and adversity, although difficult, can create resilience in life. Without adversity, life lacks a certain strength and tenacity. So if we look at this again, seeing that elemental mirror of adversity and trauma, if adversity creates life wisdom in the elemental world that can aid its ability to survive rather than impede it, that can be true on all levels of life, including our own. In Colorado, there's a bristlecone pine grove in the Collegiate Mountains that is truly amazing sight to see. So the interesting thing about these bristlecone pines is that they often don't live very long unless they're subject to extreme environmental conditions and harsh environmental conditions. So in this case, you hike up to this grove of bristlecone pines, and which is called Windy Ridge, and it's the Windy Ridge Grove. And you're walking up through a forest of bristlecone that are young, normal-looking trees. And then as you come up onto this ridge, you're coming up onto this exposed ridge where during the winter, the winds are extremely intense and very cold. And you can see how it just comes roaring down from the mountain peaks and just blasts this group of bristlecone. And they're bent and twisted, and they are stripped of their bark almost completely on one side, so it's down to just the bare wood of the pine. But because of this adversity, a tree that normally only lives maybe 100 years turns out to live several thousand. And you can really feel it when you stand next to these ancient spirits. They have a different feel to them. And so if I was to see the power of the Firwalik in the earth, it is one of those places that I see them is in the bristlecone pine. In contrast to the Firwalik, we have the Tuatha. And the Tuatha, very similar, obviously descended from one people, still fairy beings, still in that second dream of the earth. They are the roots of inspiration and the natural world's ability to inspire culture through the sheer majesty of the living earth. And they also represent, especially in places like Ben Bulben, mountains, peaks, sacred places, those areas of biological or geological life and power that when you step into them, something changes in your spirit, something is affected, something is inspired, something is awoken. And that is that connection to the dream of the earth, the dream of the cosmos that we're feeling. And that is the inspiration behind all the arts. So if you look at the Tuatha as sort of the ultimate muses, the first artisans of poetry, the first sculptors, the first painters, the first singers, the first musicians, this level of life that can only come into being when the foundation of the Favoira has been laid, the foundation of the soil and the Firwalik has been laid, and the coming of the Tuatha represents a different phase of life. But it seems very clear from the stories and the tradition of Ireland that the Tuatha are definitely not seen as safe powers. And this especially comes out in the story with the three sorceresses, so Baib, Macha, and the Morian. And they mirror, in many ways, the three queens of the Tuatha: Eru, Fola, and Banva. So the three queens are the givers of life, and the three sorceresses, in many ways, are the givers of death. The three queens bring beginnings, the three sorceresses bring endings. The storm of blood is often the way in the natural world how change can manifest, great change. It can be direct and very overwhelming. And this threshold of one phase of life moving into another is again often, the cause of intense fear and alarm. So in many ways, we have to come to some sort of terms with what these powers mean and our relationship to them. And to the Celts, to the Irish, this was, worship. It was prayer. It was supplication. It was offerings. And there's more to it than just keeping these forces at bay from your community. There's more to it than just a fear relationship. It also acknowledges very directly and very honestly how those forces are inevitable in any life, and how we interact and how we interface with them makes all the difference. So on a cosmic level, the three sorceresses are the initial forces that break tension and stagnation. Without the ability to create endings, there can be no obvious chance for beginnings. And without these breakings, without these threshold times where one old order of life is broken down, then life can't flourish. What I also find interesting about the stories of Ireland especially is that in none of the spirits, none of the fairy people who originally come to Ireland, none of them are indigenous to Ireland. They are called to Ireland. Ireland, the oldest base consciousness of Ireland, is the one that calls them there. So she decides who comes. She decides who is indigenous. She decides who to accept and who not to accept. And what I really love about this idea is that all are indigenous to life and none are. So over the vast stretch of time, life is always nomadic. And with this kernel of understanding, you can really see that if we're all on a journey, if we're all going from creation to the fulfillment of the great song, then there really is no tribe other than life and the various ways in which it manifests. And along with this, in the story, we have the example of Teal'chu fostering Lu. And we're seeing that echo of the colossal power of Danu, the colossal power of the mighty mother. And the Celts really had this wisdom that knew that motherhood transcends bloodline, motherhood transcends lineage, and the power of motherhood can even give birth to forms of creation that are very different from its predecessors. Nebulas give birth to stars, stars give birth to planets, planets give birth to life, and each relies on some form of protection from the earlier states of life so that they can fully develop. Moving on to the second spiral through the story, the sea level of the story, which is the cultural level of the story, is this theme of a legacy of trauma and how trauma affects culture, and by affecting culture, how it affects us. So the story begins with this oppression of the Firwalek by these overlords in these islands in the south. So that turns this group of Nemedians into the Firwalek. Their experiences create a different people. They create a different outlook. They create a different culture. And our culture can be shaped, obviously, by trauma. So when we look at the events of what happens to the Firwalek during their time ruled by the overlords in these islands to the south, they're clearly ruled by beings that are more powerful than them. And it gives us two questions when we look at these events. How does your culture use trauma as a counselor? And how is your culture ruled by trauma as a puppet master? Clearly, many times when there is a loss of land, there is a loss of community and a loss of sovereignty. So modern day equivalents of this would be something like the exodus of Tibetans out of Tibet into northern India. These kinds of land takings, conquering of someone else's territory. It's not just the ability for people to feed themselves or to shelter themselves. It's that place where their community is nurtured. It's that place where their stories have grown up, their relation with the spirits in the land around them. Everything depends often on that connection with the land. So this can be very traumatic, obviously, for a culture, and this is exactly what happens to the Firwalek. But if the language, the music, the stories, and the spiritual tradition of a culture are kept alive, it can survive those times, often with the ultimate goal of going home. When the Tuatha Dé Danann arrive back at home, because their stories call them home, there are two reactions that are shown in the story on a cultural level of how a people can respond to trauma or oppression by another culture or another force. And this is represented in a lot of ways by two kings. So Feidhgin, the Despoiler, and Yohi MacGearc. Feidhgin represents a king among the Firbolg in whom trauma is a puppet master. Living without power bred lust for personal power in Feidhgin at any cost. And this is the birth of tyranny. This is the birth of tyranny through traumatic events in the past, creating a reaction that views the world as dangerous. And if the world is dangerous, then the only way to live is to hoard power at all costs and maintain dominion over others. But if the culture as a whole takes this direction, then the fabric of community comes apart and the culture is ultimately doomed. The additional cost of Feidhgin's corruption is mirrored in the land, and this is the old Celtic wisdom of the king and the land are one, the people and the land are one. So when we look at climate change today, or we look at the destruction of waterways and oceans, and our decisions to make pipelines where they shouldn't go, this is exactly this old wisdom speaking to us that says that our desire to protect ourselves, our desire to control what we see as a dangerous world, ends up creating the very fears that we are seeking to avoid. Yohi and Telchu represent, in the Firbolg, the wisdom of two leaders in whom trauma is a counselor, not a puppet master. So in their cases, living without power created a desire for no one to ever live without power, for no one to ever live without sovereignty over their own life. So it creates a desire for justice. It creates a desire for the equitable share of the abundance that life offers. And the benefit is justice, and the benefit is also mirrored in the land as well. The rain only falls as softly as dew, and there are harvests every year under Yohi's reign, and they're good harvests, and so the people flourish because of this underlying spiritual, cultural metaphysic that sees trauma as a counselor and is not allowed and doesn't allow themselves to be used as trauma as a puppet master. On a cultural level, the storm of blood conjured by the three sorceresses are events like Bloody Sunday, the Battle of Little Bighorn, the assault on Liège that started World War I. So we'll take Bloody Sunday as an example. So Bloody Sunday is a terrible event that happened in Derry in Ireland on the 30th of January 1972, where 26 unarmed civilians were shot and killed during a peaceful protest against mass internment of people suspected of being involved in the IRA with very little due process or very little evidence against them. And on that day, which is pretty infamous now in Irish history, many of them were shot in the back as they were running away. Many of them were shot while they were giving aid to those who were already wounded, and 2 were actually run down by army vehicles. Later investigations of this, although at the time it was claimed by the British soldiery that the shots were fired and there was some sort of provocation, later investigations showed that there was none. And these are events of true horror when the destiny of a culture is literally being rewritten. And if you look at the story and the way the Celts directly and honestly confront these kinds of events, and the three sorceresses are said to revel in the shedding of blood. Or, like Faharua says in the story, Red Baib will thank them for the battle combats I look on. Again, these are not safe powers even on a cultural level. But could the thanking of Red Baib also include the inevitable restoration of harmony? A ray of hope always exists even in these terrible events. So looking back at the cosmic level of the story, we're reminded that what we're seeing here is simply a threshold, an earlier level of life giving way to a new level of life. And this is a threshold time only. So how we approach this threshold is up to us. In contrast to Bloody Sunday, but still along the same lines of violence, you have someone like Father Alec Reed, who's a personal hero of mine, who found himself one day in West Belfast witnessing two British soldiers who had accidentally driven into a Republican funeral being dragged from their vehicles. And it was a mistake. They did not mean to be there. But there had just been a terrible act of violence a few days earlier at a funeral where the funeral party had been attacked with grenades and gunshots. So that anger, again, the memory of that trauma created in everybody in those times the puppet masters of anger and fear. So they were dragged from these vehicles. They were two corporals in the British Army, and they were beaten into an inch of their life. And Father Reed, who witnessed this, went over to them, and they were laying down on the ground, and he put his arms over them. And his hope was that he wanted to protect them. He was seeing that, this was not the way in which these conflicts can be resolved. It just heightens the tension. It spirals the violence into a new level of horror. But those who were around him, even though he was a respected member of the Catholic community, he was forced off of them and escorted away. And as he was escorted away, he was going to his car. He was hoping to follow them to try to save them because he really felt in the atmosphere that they were going to be shot. But as he was escorted and forced away, he heard two gunshots and they were killed. So at risk to himself, he turned around and and gave them the last rites. He anointed them. Here was a Catholic priest showing compassion for British soldiers, and it became an iconic image of the need of the end of the Troubles. So this is a confrontation with the three sorceresses in these times of endings where violence and bloodshed is spiraling out of control. And they're meeting us at these threshold points. And we decide how those threshold points play out. And even the interjection of one person and one act of compassion can make great change. So when the image was seen, there was a photographer who happened to be there and took the images of him giving the last rites to these soldiers. When these images were seen, it was a real marker of just how depraved and how bad the whole situation had become. And it began to change the consciousness of the people who saw that image of compassion in the midst of bloodshed that helped to eventually bring about the end of the Troubles. In times like these, our relationship with the overwhelming presence of Baib determines the next outcome. In this instance, Father Reed is an example of clarity and compassion, showing its strength in the midst of that violence. And we can only show that strength in the midst of that violence if we are committed to the truth, if we are committed to developing our own inner clarity in the times when we're alone, when we're facing our own demons, or when we're praying, when we're making offerings, when we're singing to the gods, when we're doing the fesh, when we're celebrating the turn of the seasons. Srang and Bress are examples in the story of just this kind of connection between enemies, between one tribe and another, between one need and another. They're able to see the needs of their own people, and they're able to not fall into the blindness of my tribe and only my tribe, right or wrong. As a spiritual leader, as a druid, as a witch, as a priest, whatever you happen to call yourself and whatever tradition you happen to belong, you are meant to be a bridge between the needs of your people and the world around them. We can't be effective as druids, as spiritual leaders, as seekers even, if we only take the side of our own community and only see the needs of our own community. And Srang and Bress, Alec Reed, they show this power to have one foot in the world of our own tribe and one foot in the world of another. Without this ability to bridge, we cannot be effective druids. It's a very powerful story, and if you get a chance, I recommend, there's a really brilliant documentary on Alec Reed, Father Alec Reed, and what he did, and I'll put the link in the show notes, on the podcast and here on the YouTube video as well. Referring back to the cosmic level of the story, we also see that these times, even though they can be horrible and very scarring, they can also be the source of the discovery of deep strengths. And we should never forget that when we go through these times or we witness things of true horror in our lives. The Firwalek learn the magic of enhancing life. They become allies to the soil. And it also gives us that question of, is part of our learning on this earth about understanding trauma intimately, personally, so we can become agents of learning to heal it, learning to cleanse it. So Firwalek and Tuatha each ends up informing the other after their initial sundering, even through the course of this conflict and their eventual reconciliation at the end of the war, at the end of the battle. In fact, their journey as spiritual beings, as a people, as a tribe, is not really very complete without the experience of the other. The Firwalek bring a knowledge of the resilience and the idea and the knowing of what it means to be an oppressed people, and how you can take the events that are difficult and horrific and cause tremendous suffering and turn them into something else, turn them into life. One of the other really powerful images of the story is during the Battle of Moiturakuna, when the Firwalek form this great arch and charge into the ranks of the Tuatha, and their aggression is so overwhelming that most of the Tuatha flee, except for the ones who tie themselves to the pillars of the dead. And this is extremely powerful image. This is like, on a cultural level, this would be like protesters against apartheid in South Africa marching towards a line of soldiers and singing songs to their ancestors for strength and wisdom and resilience and protection. When we make a collective effort to speak on behalf of the dead, we link into a chain of power that goes all the way back to creation, back to the moment in which our ancestors have experienced oppression themselves, or the moment in which an island erupts and lava covers everything, and a few months later, a few seeds break through the soil and create the journey back to life. we're linking into those times. We're creating that wormhole and bringing that power into the now. Speaking on behalf of the dead is also, very important in a lot of other reasons on a cultural level. This, speaking for the dead is like, how schools in Germany teach about the Holocaust. They don't whitewash it. They don't try to forget it. They don't try to excuse it. They demonstrate to the youth of Germany the true horrors of the Holocaust. And that shows a real commitment not only to truth, but it gives their culture the ability to not repeat it. Because only when we don't let the dead speak, only when we don't let the past speak, are we doomed to repeat it again. In the end, however, it is the Tuatha Dé Danann who win. And I believe what this really speaks to is that for a healthy resolution to these deep conflicts, magic, hope, learning, culture, art, they must win in order for us to move forward as a people. But the memory of the Firwalek must survive in order to inform the spirit of the fairy people as a whole with compassion. Bress ends up becoming the advocate of the Firwalek, and in so doing, not only does he safeguard the Firwalek, but he also ends up safeguarding his own people. So finally, we're getting into our last spiral of the story, the land spiral, or the personal level of the story. And this has to do again with how whether trauma is a counselor for us or whether trauma is a puppet master for us, and also our ability to choose between compassion and revenge. One of the more personal scenes is the story is Yohi's dream of the coming of the Tuatha Dé Danann to Ireland. And dreams are important in every indigenous tradition on the planet, and it was no less with the Celts. So the dream of the coming of Tuatha Dé Danann is a personal revelation for Yohi as a king. But he also, in some ways, embodies or holds the Dawn for his people. And Dawn meaning destiny. Dreams end up shaping Dawn. And they speak to us through the veil of our past, through the veil of our past lives, through the veil of our experience. So in his dream, the crows attack Yohi in his dream and his people. But when the Tuatha Dé Danann arrive, they want to actually share the land. They're painted in the guise of crows, attacking crows by Yohi's past, by Yohi's and his culture's oppression from the past. We would, however, be fools to really ignore our dreams. So Yohi goes to his druid, Kesert, and asks him the meaning of the dream. And it presents to us again on a personal level when we're able to step back and look at whether it's our dreams, our experiences, our relationships with other people. To what extent is the trauma or experiences of our past advising us as a counselor or ruling over us as a puppet master? So finally, we're getting into our last spiral of the story, the land spiral, or the personal level of the story. And this has to do again with how whether trauma is a counselor for us or whether trauma is a puppet master for us, and also our ability to choose between compassion and revenge. One of the more personal scenes is the story is Yohi's dream of the coming of the Tuatha Dé Danann to Ireland. And dreams are important in every indigenous tradition on the planet, and it was no less with the Celts. So the dream of the coming of Tuatha Dé Danann is a personal revelation for Yohi as a king. But he also, in some ways, embodies or holds the Dawn for his people. And Dawn meaning destiny. Dreams end up shaping Dawn. And they speak to us through the veil of our past, through the veil of our past lives, through the veil of our experience. So in his dream, the crows attack Yohi in his dream and his people. But when the Tuatha arrive, they want to actually share the land. They're painted in the guise of crows, attacking crows by Yohi's past, by Yohi's and his culture's oppression from the past. We would, however, be fools to really ignore our dreams. So Yohi goes to his druid, Kesert, and asks him the meaning of the dream. And it presents to us again on a personal level, when we're able to step back and look at whether it's our dreams, our experiences, our relationships with other people, to what extent is the trauma or experiences of our past advising us as a counselor or ruling over us as a puppet master. The clarity of our vision determines whether we know if we have a choice at all between the puppet master and the counselor when it comes to our trauma. If we have well-developed clarity, then we will see that we have a choice in those situations on how we're going to react, or how current actions are being affected by past actions. If we don't have a good clarity, and our mind is very clouded and it's caught up in the day-to-day buzz of the world, then we're not even going to know that we have that choice in the first place. And as druids, we have a variety of techniques that enable us to clarify our clarity. So we have meditation, song, dance. We have the ceremonies of the turning year. We have offerings. We have exercise. We have going out into the natural world and just opening our spirit to it. And especially today, when the tension in the world is continuing to rise based on the number of challenges that we're facing as a civilization, as a planetary civilization, you're going to see in a lot of people an instinctive need that can become an extinctive need to revert to dichotomous thinking. So it's either good or it's bad, it's black or it's white, it's us versus them. And we have to be committed as druids, I believe, to continually giving people the experience of the gray, to letting them see that although it's an old survival instinct we have to go into dichotomous thinking, to think our tribe is more important than the other. But that's getting to the point where it's really no longer workable as a culture, as a society. So druids, priests, witches, spiritual leaders of any kind can play a role in coaxing people out of their dichotomous thinking. And so we have to ask ourselves, when we are standing between two opposites in a conflict, how do we reconcile that conflict in a harmonious way? Because conflict will always arise. Brass and Sreng both love their people and both see the drives and the desires of their people, but they're able to step outside of their loyalty to their tribe and, one, recognize the common ancestors that they both share and honor those common ancestors, and they're able to give each other that oath of friendship regardless of what happens. And it comes to be quite clear at the end of the story that oath of friendship is what saves the Firwalek and saves the Firwalek from being driven to extinction, and it saves the spirit of the Tuatha. So there are examples even today of how people cross these really intense divides, whether they're political or religious or racial. And the one that I really want to offer as an example is the example of an IRA bomber named Shane Paulo Doherty. And he was considered one of the better letter bombers of the IRA during its heyday when the Troubles were in full force. And what's interesting is that there's a very slow escalation that he witnesses through his life that brings him to the point of becoming a terrorist or a freedom fighter, however you want to put it. He calls himself a terrorist now. I'm sure at the time he would have thought of himself as a freedom fighter. But he's told from a pretty young age that he is inferior because he's Catholic. And so he grows up in a society where the power structure is continually telling him that he's inferior because of his Catholicness. And, we have very similar things going on right here in the United States right now of people telling Muslims that they're inferior. Blacks being treated obviously by the police in a very unequal way. So there's a lot we can learn from this conflict again. And so he witnesses this slow escalation from, first they put checkpoints up between neighborhoods, trying to kind of keep track of who's going where and who's entering neighborhoods and who's leaving neighborhoods. And then that becomes a source of a lot of verbal arguments, screaming, yelling, people giving false names like Mickey Mouse and John Wayne and stuff like that. And from there, from the yelling and the insults, it goes to stone throwing, which then transforms into arrests, and from arrests to the shootings, events like Bloody Sunday, and that eventually evolves into bombings. After Bloody Sunday, when Shane was a teenager, which he says is the perfect time to recruit someone to become a terrorist, he said that he realized I could be shot dead for nothing or shot dead for something. So he could either do nothing and still be shot at, or he could fight back and be shot at still. So it becomes, in a lot of ways, a clear choice if you're completely in the survivalist mode of your brain, if you're being ruled by that trauma that is making your decisions for you, rather than being able to pull back and see that truth that is against the world. And so as time goes on, their horrific violence justifies his horrific violence justifies their horrific violence, and it starts this gradual uptick in the violence and the mistrust between Protestants and Catholics. So he goes on to plant letter bombs in London, and a number of them go off and people are killed. And the entire thing escalates, and eventually there is a ceasefire that is brokered between the IRA and the British government. And so since there's the ceasefire, Shane decides that he wants to go home because he hasn't seen his mother in quite some time. And on his way, a lot of people are telling him not to do it, that he's going to get arrested if he goes back, but he decides to go anyway. And sure enough, they do arrest him. And one of the interesting things is that he was told specifically by the police who arrested him that they were deliberately arresting him to wreck the ceasefire so that they could continue to raise the level of violence and get revenge for things that they felt had been done wrong to them as well. And we have a similar thing here in the United States now, where some policemen are clearly killing black people and treating them in horrible ways. And then we have the pushback where policemen who were not responsible for those particular crimes are then targeted and ambushed and shot themselves. So we're getting very, very close to this level of violence if we're not careful. And that's why Druids really need to step forward right now and start speaking towards the gray, start speaking for peace, start speaking for reconciliation, and start speaking for truth. So Shane gets put in prison, and he spends quite some time there, obviously, for those kind of crimes. And the only thing that changed him was people visiting him from who he considered his enemies his whole life. And so he says, "What undermined my belief in the IRA more than anything were the Gospels. And hats off to the Brits. When I was an unrepentant terrorist, not only did 2 Labour MPs visit me doggedly, but Cardinal Basil Hume visited me as well. There was this British openness to the enemy, and it helped me change my life, and my life helped to change other people's lives. So when you see that there is this reconciliation, there is a need for negotiation, there is a need for talk. We say, well, we shouldn't negotiate with terrorists. Well, I think we can pretty much guarantee at this point that if we don't negotiate and we don't try to understand, then we will probably be dealing with this problem in perpetuity. So this kind of willingness to reach out to what we consider the ugly, what we consider the horrible, the violent, and the destructive is probably the only way we have to change it and to heal the divide between us and them. He goes on to say, I never forgot these people who crossed the divide of horror and tabloid criticism. To me, that's a heroic story that no one has ever told. I've always felt that the acts of those people to go to the enemy and listen and learn and engage saved me. Any time my name was mentioned in the papers, there was this screaming excess, but behind the scenes, these people kept visiting and helping me to grow up out of my teenage horror. Just like in the story, when Sreng says to Bress, this is the proper time to bear it in mind. If we are, in flesh and blood, of the same distinguished race as you, we should humble our pride, let our hearts draw closer, be mindful of our brotherhood, and prevent the destruction of our own people. So when the Druids spoke of the truth against the world, I believe one of the things that it meant was that the world favors the dichotomous thinking, the black and white, the us versus them. And the truth is always between us and them. It's always between Republican, Democrat. It's always between, liberal and conservative, and all of those labels that we give each other to archetypalize what we actually believe and to conveniently pigeonhole each other into a particular category of opinion. So it's important for Druids to recognize their own tendency to fall into dichotomous thinking, which is why thinking in threes is considered so sacred in the tradition. So you have right, you have wrong, and you have that truthful part in yourself that can see what is actually happening, that clarity that enables you to choose, one or the other for the right situation in the right way. So defeating your own dichotomous thinking and changing it into something else, call on the gods, call on your ancestors to help you in that endeavor, because it's one of the more important things that we can engage in. And this is partly illustrated by during the battle, when the Tuatha Dé Danann tie themselves to the pillars of the dead. They're calling on the eternal power of the dead, linking their spark to the dead, and which links them all the way back to the moment of creation. And not only does it anchor us in our ancestor spirit, but we can also look at this as what pillars do you tie yourself to as a Druid? Do you tie yourselves to the pillars of compassion, to the standing stones of love, truth, understanding, communication, balance? Or do you tie yourself to the standing stones of fear and greed and hopelessness and cynicism and xenophobia and mistrust? And that's the reason why developing our clarity as Druids through prayer, through ritual, through all of the technologies that we've come up with is so important, because it gives our clarity its ability to step out from behind the curtains of our own ignorance to make the right decision at the right time. But as they say, no one really gets through this life unscathed, and for some it's far more difficult than it is for others, and we need to understand that. We can be frustrated with the way in which people react when they're under stress or they're under oppression, wanting them to make a different choice. But unless we have compassion for where they are right now, we also can't be effective in pulling them out of it, because we either get angry at them and frustrated, or we get angry and frustrated in the world, decide that it's never going to change, so why bother, and we throw up our hands and we walk away. And so I want to talk a little bit about the short part in the story where they talk about the sons of Gaurin who defend Yohimakirk. And so the story says, "It was known that whomsoever was wounded by one of the sons of Gaurin were also cursed. From the time of their wound forward, they would have no joy in life." And it's very clear to a lot of people, both with psychiatrists and counselors, that when emotional trauma is combined with physical trauma, it's typically the hardest to heal, because there's that constant reminder in the body of the event. And emotional, trauma is trauma. It can be, even if there's no actual physical harm, it doesn't mean that it's easy for it to heal. But when it's combined, it's typically much worse. Rape victims, torture victims, PTSD from combat where there's physical mutilation involved. These things can hurt the soul as much as they hurt the body, and the soul can definitely be scarred. If you get a chance, there's some interesting work by a psychiatrist called Dr. Ian Stevenson, who was at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, and he spent most of his career studying reincarnation. And one of the comes up with a tremendous amount of it's very interesting, all of his research. But one of the things that's the most interesting about what he discovers is that because he went all over the world interviewing children who had these very clear recollections of their past lives, and he noticed that in about 35% of the cases, that many of them had birthmarks where their fatal wound had been given in their previous life, whatever had killed them. So someone who was, hit hard in the back of the head would have this really big birthmark in the back of the head in the same place that they remembered the strike to be. A shot to the heart, there was a birthmark right over the heart that corresponded to the size of a bullet wound. So we can carry trauma from life to life. And not only can it affect the imprint of our soul, but the soul is the foundation for the body. So the way in which the body develops is led by the soul. It corresponds to the map that the soul gives it. So we have to remember that trauma and dichotomous thinking and rash actions are driven by something. And unless we have compassion for that, we can't effectively heal it. And it underscores the importance of dealing with our trauma in this life. And that's why the ancestors, the Shi, the gods and goddesses, and our Anamhara in our Druid circles are so important to help us to accomplish that, because we can't do it alone. And one god to call on specifically in this kind of endeavor is the king of the Tuatha Nua. Nua really embodies that spirit of overcoming great physical and emotional trauma. So, in the story, when he gets his arm cut off, he doesn't leave the battle. He does not allow himself to get carried away until he stands up on a small pile of stones so that all the Tuatha can see him, and he raises his remaining arm in victory. And not only does it bolster them, but it reminds him that he's not defeated. And each of us has that spark of Nua in our spirit, the ability to overcome the worst that can be thrown at us and still retain our strength and our honor and our hope. So if this is a struggle for you personally, I'd highly recommend calling on Nua, giving him offerings, sitting down, dedicating an altar to him, lighting a candle. And you don't have to pray formally. You don't have to try to sugarcoat it or be formal. Just open up and be honest with Nua about what it is that has affected you and that you need help in healing it. Last but certainly not least, we have The Fosterage of Lu by Teal'c. And one of the things that was really easy to miss in the story is the context of the battle with the Firwalek that takes place before they ask Telchu to foster Lu. The choice between compassion and revenge is really given center stage in this part of the story. So when you consider that the killers of her husband are the ones who are entrusting their most valuable son to her, there's a lot going on. There's a real cauldron of emotion taking place in this fosterage setup. And the Tuatha Dé Danann evidently trust her enough with their foster son, their most favored son, and she evidently has enough power to protect him from Balor. So when you really put yourself in Telchu's place, being asked to foster this boy, there's really a lot that the story is saying about how we can approach what was once a contentious relationship and bring it into something that is healed and peaceful. So you can really ask yourself, how would you feel if you were asked a similar task? And would you be able to put aside your grief and your anger to foster a child who is innocent of the war that has just taken place and basically innocent of the killing of your beloved, your husband in this case? But somehow, evidently, Telchu does find a way to put aside her grief and her sadness and her anger and comes to love Lu and comes to take care of him. So what can we learn from this? You know, this is really the power of motherhood being displayed here, and not just the power of a biological mother, but the power of a foster mother, the power of someone who is able to open their heart to another living thing based solely on the merit of protecting a child from the dangers of the world. And not only is she protecting Lu from the dangers of the world, she's also literally breaking this chain of violence that was set into motion when the Tuatha Dé Danann started to fight with the Firwalek. So she's not only protecting Lu, but she's healing the world when she does this. She also provides Lu with his first example of selflessness and sacrifice. So he grows up, evidently, under her care and sees the way in which she takes care of him. And I always like to picture I picture them sitting around a fire one night and Telchu finally telling him, when he's older, the history of their people, telling him of Yohi, her husband, describing to him her love for her husband and the way in which he was killed and the way in which he was taken from her by his tribe. And the fact that she, despite all of that anger, despite all of that grief, despite all of that past history, that trauma, she still has come to love Lu as a son. And with Telchu, she really makes Lu the child of three people. The Favoira from his mother and Balor, the Tuatha Dé Danann through Cian, and now the Firwalek as well through her fosterage. So he's able to draw on the spirit of all three of these peoples in his collective bloodline now. And if he wasn't the child of these three tribes, could he have ended up going on to do what he ends up doing, saving Ireland from the Favoira? So Telchu is not only a goddess that brings life and fertility. So when she cuts down the forest, she defeats the famine that is making the people of Ireland suffer. And in so doing, she's also killing herself because her life force is tied to the forest that she's cutting down. But this other side of her is this challenge to Druids, to pagans, to reach deeper levels of compassion specifically when the world makes it challenging for you to do so. So she is a great ally for opening our hearts to greater levels of compassion and understanding, even against those that we've had serious conflict with in our past. Calling to Teal'c is a way in which we can slowly but steadily open our hearts to others. And you may need to accomplish that opening slowly over time, and you may really have to start even with yourself first before you can expand into others. Or start with friends, start with family, start with people that you love and cherish. But with Teal'c's power and her spirit as an ally for you, she really can increase that horizon of love and compassion for everyone and all living things. And if it weren't enough for him to see that she is putting aside her own grief and her own trauma to raise him and come to love him, she also provides him with the ultimate example of self-sacrifice when she does give her life up to feed the people of Ireland. And she also displays this very important truth that we really need to not forget, especially in today's world, that when we take resources from the earth, there's always a price. And something is giving its life for us to live, for us to eat, for us to feed. So we need to take that sacrifice seriously. And when you look at this way in which Teal'c is cutting down the forest of her own being to feed others, it's a very powerful symbol and a very powerful image for meditation. Without Teal'c, Lu wouldn't be Lu without her. And we wouldn't have the festival of Lunasa without her. Lunasa is really, when you get down to it and you look at the history of the day and the cross quarter, it is a celebration of the power of the Firwalek. The Firwalek are the only one of the 6 peoples to land on Ireland on the August cross quarter. Teal'c dies on the August cross quarter, and now we celebrate Lu on the August cross quarter. So this is a time where we can remember this story and all of the lessons that come about with this story. And with that yearly remembrance, that yearly revisit to all of the themes of the story, of this story and the fosterage of Teal'c, we can just remind ourselves in a way that allows us to unburden our spirit and live with a lot more sovereignty. So to recap our 3 spirals into the story, first we have sky, the sky level of the story. So that's the elemental or cosmic level of the story. And that's, if the nature of the cosmos is constant evolution and change, then should we panic when conflict arises from change with earlier states of life? So we know it's an inevitability. How we handle those transitions that will always come to be is one of the great tests of us as Druids. The C, the cultural spiral of the story, are these legacies of trauma. So to what extent do we lend our personal clarity to the culture around us to help it realize that it has a choice between trauma as a counselor or as a puppet master? And then land, the personal, emotional level of the story, is the choice between compassion and revenge as a personal struggle. And if we choose, we can embark on an inner quest to seek greater clarity and to open our hearts to what we consider to be our opposite or our enemy. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope this helps illuminate part of the story. This, of course, is my take on the story, but I think if you look at it and you really read it and you try to put yourself in the perspective of the characters in the story, you'll see that there's a lot of source of meditation and contemplation there. So Next time, we'll get back to the story, and we'll be going on to Lose Time with Manan and Maclir and the second battle of Moitura. Slángafoil.